So thank you all so much for joining us for Living with Wild Turkeys in Massachusetts with MassWildlife. Wild turkeys, the official game bird of Massachusetts, thrive in a variety of habitats across the Commonwealth, including in urban and suburban areas. This morning, we're going to learn about wild turkey biology and behavior, as well as how residents can coexist with these beautiful birds. And this presentation is led by Meghan Crawford, who's the Community Engagement Biologist with MassWildlife, as well as David Scarpitti, a turkey biologist with MassWildlife. Hope I got all that right. So all nearly 150 of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Meghan and David for joining us here this morning. And Meghan, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Beautiful. Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Robert. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this lovely Tuesday morning. As Robert mentioned, my name is Meghan Crawford, and I am the Community Engagement Biologist at the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. And I'm going to be leading most of this presentation all about living with wild turkeys in Massachusetts. And we'll get into more formal introductions in a moment. But I think where we could possibly start is just learning a little bit about who we are as an agency. So again, I call this Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. When we want to shorten that, we just call ourselves MassWildlife. And sometimes we get a little confused with other state agencies. We always like to just kind of remind people of who we are, maybe introduce ourselves if you haven't worked with MassWildlife before. So we are the state agency that is responsible for the conservation of freshwater fish and wildlife across the state. And so this includes common and abundant wildlife, animals you might see in your own backyard, but it also includes endangered plants and animals too. And on top of that, we're also responsible for restoring, protecting, and managing land across the state so that wildlife can thrive and people can enjoy it. And we actually manage over 230,000 acres of land across the state that's open to the public to use. So after that introduction, I think I'll take a moment to introduce myself a little bit more. So as I said, my name is Meghan, and I'm the Community Engagement Biologist. I've been in this role for a little short of 2 years. And as you can imagine, my job is doing a whole lot of this, is doing presentations for the public, engaging with the public, and helping the public just better understand the wildlife that they may see in their neighborhoods. So that is a lot of what I do, and it's a good time. But I'll let my coworker, Dave Scarpitti, take a moment to introduce himself too.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. As Meghan said, I'm Dave Scarpitti. I'm the turkey and upland game biologist for Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife. So what exactly does that mean? That means I do a lot of different things with a lot of different species. Basically, I focus and prioritize all of our upland game birds and wild turkeys. So game birds, including things like ruffed grouse, American woodcock, things like pheasant and quail and doves, sorry, not doves, mourning doves, and all those kinds of critters, and also small game, so things like squirrels and rabbits and hare. My job is basically to focus on assessing those populations, determining, making decisions about harvest management or harvest regulations for those species. I deal with a ton of public inquiries when people have issues with wildlife. I'm one of the persons that they're going to talk to specifically when we're talking about turkeys. We don't tend to get a lot of people complaining about snowshoe hare or ruffed grouse causing problems, but turkeys are definitely one of them. I've been a biologist with MassWildlife now for almost 18 years, which seems just completely impossible that it's gone by that quickly. But sure enough, 18 years with MassWildlife as a biologist. So Meghan's going to do most of the talking here, hopefully. Again, having been involved with these species for so long, I'm just here to provide a little bit of context if anything strange or any strange or unusual questions come up.
Super. And I know some folks are using that chat feature, which is great. We'll hold all the questions until the end, and we'll have some questions for you throughout, and we'll do our best to try and see what you're saying in the chat. But with a lot of you out there and just a few of us, we'll do the best that we can. But let's hop in. So today for this presentation, which again, this sort of formal part is going to be hopefully around 40 minutes or so, maybe a little short. of that. And we're gonna talk about a few things. First, we're gonna start with learning a little bit about wild turkey history here in our state, wild turkey biology and behavior. We're going to talk a little bit about the steps we can take to successfully coexist with these animals, and then we'll get into a Q&A session at the end and hopefully answer everybody's questions out there. So let's hop into wild turkey history in Massachusetts, because this might actually be maybe more interesting than you would originally think. And we're going to kick it off with actually a question for you, a nice true or false question. So our question is, or I should say our statement is, turkeys have always been present in Massachusetts. So if you were to select true, that would mean yes, there have always been turkeys in Massachusetts. There was never a time that there wasn't turkeys. And false would be no, there was a time where turkeys were not found in Massachusetts. So you can use that chat feature if you would like to share your guess for this question, or you can just think in your mind, or if you're joining with your family or friends, you could talk with them. Oh, but I am seeing a good mix of trues and falses. I'd almost say 50-50 if I were to count them up. But nice. Okay. Sounds like we have a good crowd here that's ready to be engaged and learn, I guess, a little bit about turkey history. So a surprising answer here is false. So there was a period of time where turkeys were not in Massachusetts. Now, don't get me wrong, turkeys are originally from Massachusetts. They are native to Massachusetts, but there was a period of time, about 120 years, where turkeys could not be found in our state. So we're going to dive into this a little bit. And we're going to take us all the way back, actually, to the early 1600s. So we're thinking prior to European settlement. This is a kind of terrible map of turkey distribution across North America, but kind of bear with us, and even just we can focus our attention to Massachusetts up there with that very light shaded gray. That is showing that turkeys were found pretty much across the entire state. They were just not necessarily on the islands, but they were across the state. And there was a subspecies of wild turkey, eastern turkey, in Massachusetts at this time. And this is generally what Massachusetts looked like at this time. So again, taking us back to the 1600s, prior to European settlers coming, there was a lot of mixed hardwood forests. And this is a pretty good habitat for turkeys to exist in. They like to roost up in trees. That's where they feel nice and safe at night to protect themselves from predators. So this was a pretty good spot to be a turkey in. And there was thought to be about 40,000 turkeys across the state at this time. Again, pretty much found everywhere except for Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. But there was a big shift upon European settlement and the change in land use during that time. And so there was this big conversion from those forested lands into more agricultural lands. And that was to, provide sustenance to the people that were coming and settling. And you can see that's a pretty big difference. There's not a whole lot of trees on this landscape. So again, that opportunity for turkeys to be able to roost up in those trees and protect themselves from predators became pretty minimal. But there was also, during this time, MassWildlife, like an agency like MassWildlife, did not exist. People weren't necessarily looking out for exactly how many turkeys were out on the landscape and whether we were sustainably taking them or not to feed ourselves, our families, and the like. And so there was a lot of unregulated take and use harvest of turkeys. And these two things really kind of combined, both these huge changes in habitat conditions and land use, that big conversion from forested land to agricultural land, and in combination with this unregulated take of turkeys, led to turkeys eventually no longer being present in Massachusetts, or what we call extirpated, which means they're just not found within the state. And that occurred right around 1850 is when turkeys were really no longer found in Mass. And this was not unique to Massachusetts. So here I present another kind of subpar map here of an updated turkey range. But this just goes to show that this wasn't only occurring in Massachusetts. It was really occurring across the country. And you can see this big difference in turkey distribution, especially if we think back to that map I showed you earlier, where it was really all shaded gray. We have these sort of just pockets remaining. Again, all related to that change in land use and the unregulated take of turkeys. But you may be thinking, wait, I definitely know that we have turkeys in Massachusetts now. So how did we come to be, once again, to have turkeys be a common and abundant animal in our state? And this kind of brings us to wild turkey restoration in our state. And like all good things, originally a lot of attempts were failures. So the first attempt was made in the early 1900s, and those attempts were continued even through the early 1960s. And I won't go into the details of each of these attempts, but really what it came down to is that the birds that were used in these restoration attempts, these attempts to get wild birds back out on the landscape and independent, they were game farm turkeys, and they just, it became abundantly clear that they just did not have the behaviors needed to be successful wild birds. They were just easily picked off by predators. They just really weren't built for that wild turkey life. And so it really became clear that if a restoration attempt was going to be successful, it had to be done with wild birds. And so that brings us to the successful restoration of wild turkeys. And so in 1972, leading into 1973, we worked with New York State officials to trap 37 wild turkeys from New York and relocate them to Massachusetts. And they were released in a section of the Beartown State Forest, which is out in Berkshire County, so western Massachusetts, as indicated by that lovely yellow star there. So let's talk a little bit more about this sort of trap and transplant, as we call it. So again, these turkeys were wild. They were in New York. That was likely the closest wild turkeys to us. So we went and trapped 37 of them. 15 of them were adult males, 16 were adult females, and 6 were unsexed juveniles, so uncertain of the sex of those. And then they were sort of released in 2 batches. One was released in March of 1972, and the second was released in September of 1973. And 3 of them were fixed with radio transmitters at the time that were sort of attached to their back, and an attempt to just understand how they were moving, were they surviving. Unfortunately, that didn't end up providing a whole lot of information, as one that was tracked died shortly after release from an unknown cause of mortality, and then the 2 others, they like moved across the landscape, maybe like over a hill, and then we lost contact. Again, the technology then is a lot different than what we have now. So otherwise, some of the birds were banded in a way where the public or officials could go out and take a look and see if these birds were successfully reintroduced to the landscape. And they certainly were. So this is a map of the sort of that immediate range expansion of those wild turkeys that were trapped in New York and then placed in Massachusetts. So that darker kind of black shaded in circle there, that's that distribution between 1972 and 1974. So within those first 2 years, you can see they established and they spread out a little bit. And then you can see the red is that further expansion. And then that green is that, again, further expansion leading up to 1978. And just to kind of try and put this into context, is this was really rapid dispersal in such a short period of time, 6 years really. So this was very impressive and very exciting. And it really just showed that like the habitat conditions at this time, they were like ready for turkeys. There was at this time, just, it wasn't just those expansive agricultural fields that we were talking about, in the 1800s. Now we had a mix of forested land, we had a mix of agricultural fields, we had a mix of just other open fields, and these mixed habitats are really quite optimal for turkeys. And this just goes to show, again, the habitat was ready for these turkeys to come back. We just needed turkeys that had those more wild behaviors to be successful. And so following this, we moved into doing what we call in-state trap and transplant. So instead of going to New York and getting more birds, we instead trapped birds that were in that range in western Massachusetts and then releasing them in other sites across the state to have that, again, returning to those turkeys across the state of Massachusetts. And so there was 26 release sites across 10 counties. Little over 550 turkeys were relocated all within Massachusetts borders. And you'll see all these release sites are indicated by these like red stars in across the state there. And then the blue is that initial release site. And you'll see at this time, this was occurring between 1979 and 1996. And at this time, these locations weren't very developed areas. They were more rural. They weren't quite as developed as maybe you perceive them as today. And it was really originally thought that that was where turkeys were going to be successful. They weren't going to be successful in really developed areas. They weren't going to be all that successful in real close proximity to people. And so that idea initially was to have these birds released into these less developed areas, into these more rural areas. But things have changed since then, we'll say. So we'll head into our next true or false question. which is turkeys can now be found in almost every city and town in Massachusetts. So now we're thinking present day, 2024, true or false, can they be found in almost every city and town in Massachusetts? So I'll give folks a moment to share their thoughts in the chat if you have them. Excellent. Okay, I see a lot of truth. Oh yeah, I see almost entirely true. And you guys you're on it. This is a true statement. So once again, they can now be found in almost every city and town in Massachusetts, with the exception of Nantucket. And so even if I go back and we look at those release sites for a moment, right, you can see that there are no red stars. There's no release sites anywhere all that close to somewhere like Boston in these really developed areas. Again, because we didn't really think turkeys would be all that successful there in that close proximity to people. But in reality, we ended up with turkeys being quite successful in these very developed areas, and they thrive in these suburban, urban environments. And so we do have them found in virtually every city and town in the state. And that again brings us to modern day wild turkey management in Massachusetts. So present day, we're pretty much back at the same number as we were thinking about pre-colonial times, when there was about 40,000 birds across the state. We're thought to have around 35,000 in our state now. And we do have legal regulated hunting seasons for turkeys. We have 2 of them each year, one in the fall and one in the spring. And we have an annual state harvest of about 3,000 turkeys that allows people to utilize that natural resource to feed themselves, their family, their friends with that natural resource. And again, also assist with turkey management and population management, as hunting is an important tool when it comes to wildlife management in our state. So that's maybe a new history for you to have, maybe a couple fun facts for you to put in your head for when you head to your Thanksgiving table on Thursday. But now I'd like to talk a little bit about wild turkey biology and behavior. And maybe in some of the ways that people refer to wild turkeys. And maybe some of you have heard these words before. Some people might call turkeys toms or hens or jakes or jennies. And you might be like, what is this? What are people talking about? And these words are really just used to describe particular turkeys that you might see. And so we can start with just toms and hens. Toms are what we use to refer to adult male turkeys, and hens are adult female turkeys. And so we have pictures of them kind of side by side here. You might be able to look at these and start to pick out some of the visual differences between an adult male and adult female. Here are some of the ones I would point out. So males, tend to be a little bit larger in size, floating somewhere around 20 pounds or so, adult males, where females are closer to 10 pounds or so. Adult males will have nice and colorful heads. You'll see those blue and red colors. Their bodies, their general body color tends to be a little bit more of that vibrant black and vibrant brown colors. Males will have beards. So you see that sort of tuft of hair coming out of this bird's chest. They'll have beards there, and they'll also have spurs on their legs. So that bottommost circle there, kind of pointing out that little bump on their leg, they have spurs there that they use to spar against other turkeys. Where females, they're a little bit more drab in color. You see the body is, again, smaller. It's like a more muted brown. Their head is a little bit muted too, and they do not have spurs on their legs, so you won't see them. They can occasionally have beards, so that is not a sure way to tell between male or female. Some females will have beards, but they won't have spurs. And again, they're gonna be a little bit smaller in size and more drab in color. If you were to see them on the landscape, here we have 2 toms and 1 hen in the middle. And then, of course, we got to talk about jakes and jennies too. So I don't have a photo of a jenny, and that's because a jenny is a juvenile female, and generally it is difficult to tell between a jenny and a hen. And really the main difference isn't necessarily something you would see, is that jennies, they're juveniles, they're not necessarily reproducing at that time, so they're not necessarily going to be taking care of young. But otherwise, visually, kind of hard to tell the difference. But you can tell the difference between toms and jakes. So jakes are juvenile males, and again, toms are adult males. So we have that tom on the left, and we have the jake on the right here. And maybe the most obvious feature to tell the difference between these two is that jakes, juvenile males, will have uneven feather length. And so that's just them kind of getting rid of those younger feathers that they have and starting to grow in those more adult feathers. And you just get this uneven tail feather length during that time, where toms will have even tail feather. So that's a nice, easy way to tell the difference. And now I want to jump into a little bit about turkey behavior. We do get a lot of calls at MassWildlife, people just wondering what turkeys are up to, why they're acting a certain way, and their behavior is often driven by what season it is. So I figure we could start in fall, because that's what we're in now, and what you might see if you were to see a turkey out in Tewksbury, or from wherever you are if you're in Massachusetts. And at this time, you'll generally see turkeys congregated into large flocks, and you might see two types of large flocks. One being a hen, so that adult female with her family group, maybe the young of that year. And then another group might be those adult and juvenile males that come together and almost form these like bachelor groups. So you'll see those two different types of large flocks. As you head into winter, and especially as like conditions get a little bit tougher, you might see those large flocks really start to intermingle a little bit more because they're going to be competing for limited resources. They're going to be looking for places that don't have quite as deep of snow. And so they're just kind of going to get pushed into smaller spaces, and you might see a little bit more mixing in the winter time. And then when we head into spring, that's like prime turkey time. We get a lot of calls about turkey behavior during the spring, and that's because that is their breeding season. And so this is a very active time to be a turkey. This is really a time where males are trying to attract those females and strut their stuff. We're going to talk a little bit more about breeding season in a moment. But and then summer is when, following breeding season, you'll have those hens, those adult females, taking care of their young of that year. And then otherwise you have adult and juvenile males coming back together in those small groups and almost preparing to form into larger groups as they head into fall. But let's talk a little bit more about turkey breeding behavior. This is certainly an active time. It's a time where people just see and hear turkeys very often. So the breeding season runs from March to May, and males will mate with multiple females. So they are not monogamous. Males will attempt to mate with multiple females. And what you'll see is males really trying to exert their dominance over jakes, so over those younger males and other submissive adults. And this is really all rooted in this sort of essential social structure of turkeys, is what we would call, almost in a joking way, a pecking order for these birds, is that it's all about who is the most dominant turkey. And so it's all about trying not to be the most submissive. And so they just attempt to dominate one another, try and be the biggest, baddest bird out there, because that's the bird that's going to have the most success reproducing, getting access to those hens and passing on their genes. So that is really a core piece of turkey behavior, is that pecking order and that sort of urge to dominate other birds. And it especially comes into play with the breeding season. And so again, this is a time where you'll see these males really strutting their stuff, like you see this turkey in this picture, and they'll be gobbling a lot. You'll hear a lot of turkey sounds as well during this time. And of course, following breeding season, you have your waiting baby turkeys to arrive. And so we have a little, I guess, quiz question here to think about: what is a baby turkey called? So you have 4 options: a chick, a turkette, a poult, or a nestling. So if you want, you can just think about it on your own or talk about it with folks that you might be with. Welcome to share in the chat what you're thinking. Again, what is a baby turkey called? Other than cute, because man, they are cute, but we do have a science word for them. All right, I see a couple clicks and a lot of guesses for poults, a couple more guesses for chicks, nestlings. Oh, so we're pretty spread across. Nice. Okay. So a baby turkey is called a poult. So let's talk a little bit about nests, turkey nests, and poult. They're young. Following that breeding season from March to May, those hens will begin to lay their eggs. And turkeys have a nest on the ground. They're ground nesting birds, and a turkey nest will generally just look like a little shallow divot in the ground. Maybe it's leaf lined, and it will contain anywhere between 8 to 15 eggs or so, maybe on average somewhere between 12 to 13 eggs. And those eggs will hatch about 28 days after the start of incubation. And I want to talk a little bit about this. So I'll say that again. Eggs will hatch 28 days after the start of incubation. So sometimes we get calls from the public and they'll say, hey, I've seen a hen in my neighborhood. I saw that she has a nest, and the nest only has 3 eggs in it, and the hen isn't sitting on it. She's not taking care of it. I'm worried this nest is abandoned. And to that I say, fear not, because hens will lay about 1 egg a day. It takes a lot of work to lay an egg. And so she's going to lay 1 egg a day. And maybe she's going to lay 14 eggs. And so she's going to lay 1 egg a day for 2 weeks. And she is not going to sit on those eggs or incubate those eggs until she is fully done laying all the eggs. And so it's not abnormal to see a nest with 2, 3, 4 eggs not sat on at all, because she's just going to lay them and mosey about until she's fully done, and then she'll sit on those eggs and start to truly incubate all of them for about 28 days. And this is a really important piece to thinking about that turkey and that poult survival at the end, is because if she starts sitting on them all at the same time, they're going to start developing at the same rate, which then means 28 days later, they're all going to hatch at about the same time. And that is best for poult survival, is for them to all hatch at the same time. So at that point, the hen can get up and off her nest and start moving around with those poults and taking care of them and not leaving any eggs behind, or not leaving those early hatchers to kind of fend for themselves as predators may be out there, because they're certainly a snack for something like a fox or a hawk to take advantage of. So just something to keep in mind if you ever do come across a turkey nest. And so you might start to see those poults out and about in the first week of June, and they are immediately mobile, or what we call precocial. So they are up and moving more or less within 24 hours, and doesn't necessarily mean that they're independent. They still have to learn how to be a successful wild turkey. So they spend a lot of time with their mom. They'll imitate that adult hen and learn all that they need to know before they actually go venture out on their own, which males seemingly tend to leave their adults a little bit earlier than females, but generally you can see them kind of together even up until the next breeding season, when that hen will again be bred and produce more poults in the next year. And the last thing about turkey biology that I wanted to kind of talk about is turkey diet. So we could start with natural food sources, which we love to see wildlife utilizing natural food sources and those foods that they really were evolved to take advantage of in Massachusetts. And their diet is driven by what is seasonally available, what's going to be available to them at any given month. They'll eat plant material and seeds. They'll take advantage of acorns and beech nuts and hickory nuts. They'll eat berries, especially during the summertime when those are available. And a really important part of turkey diet is insects and other invertebrates that they may find on the ground. And that's especially true during that summertime, when those poults are looking to get in as much nutrients as possible, as much protein as possible, to develop into a nice strong bird. So you'll definitely see them taking advantage of those insects during those summer months. But unfortunately, turkeys also will take advantage of what we call human-associated foods. So this is the food that we as people accidentally or purposely provide wildlife around our homes. And again, we like to see wild animals utilizing natural food sources and not necessarily utilizing these human-associated food sources, because they can cause trouble, which we'll get to in a moment, but they will readily take advantage of these types of food sources. So one being bird seed, both in a bird feeder and on the ground, where the bird feeder kind of spills the seed onto the ground. And as you see in this picture, the turkeys will take advantage of that. And we do have folks that directly feed turkeys, that they'll provide corn or sunflower seeds out in their yard, and the turkeys will stick around and eat that as well. And that brings us to coexisting with turkeys. So this might even sound a little funny to you if you've never had any sort of challenges with living with turkeys, and maybe you've just seen them move about your neighborhood. But there can be very real conflict when it comes to turkeys and people living together, occupying the same space, especially in these more developed areas where a lot of food is available around our homes, and where turkeys just get a little chill, less cautious around people. So let's talk about the different types of conflict that we see between people and turkeys. One, and I guess I should say, we can kind of break down the conflict into 2 types of conflict. And we'll start with just talking about what we refer to as just general, like kind of nuisance issues, just things that might bother you, things that might just be a little bit inconvenient. So one is lawn and garden damage. Turkeys can certainly do a lot of damage to people's property. As you can see in this photo here, I believe this damage was done within hours. So they can make some quick work of it. And this again is all rooted in that biology, that behavior of them scratching at the ground to find food, especially to find those insects and vertebrates in the ground. And so they'll scratch looking for that food and can cause property damage while they do it. There's other types of property damage too. This is actually a video here of these 3 turkeys looking at the rim of one of our coworkers, cars, and it's common to see videos or see turkeys themselves pecking at vehicles, at the rims of wheels, at windows. And it's because they see their reflection in those very shiny objects and they think it's another turkey. And then they attempt to dominate that other turkey. Again, all coming back to that pecking order. And so that's why they might be seen doing something like that. So we just recommend that people try to disguise or prevent the ability for them to see those reflective images of themselves. Turkeys will block traffic. They'll hang out in the middle of the road. They might be even unbothered by, the presence of cars and like car horns. They can certainly cause a traffic jam. Their roosting behavior can be challenging too. So I talked about this earlier, is that turkeys will roost in trees, particularly at night, to protect themselves from predators. And they do this in areas where they feel safest. And sometimes they'll roost in, say, just like a large white pine or other large trees on people's property. They'll spend a lot of time there. And while they do that, of course, they are also going to the bathroom. And so people can sometimes get frustrated by that accumulation of feces that might happen under that tree. And it's not uncommon in more developed areas for turkeys to actually roost on people's porches or on the edge of their house. And again, that accumulation of feces can be pretty frustrating. And then those are all more of like what we would generally describe as like nuisance challenges, again, those inconveniences. But there's this other group of conflict that is just generally bold or aggressive behaviors from turkeys toward people. And that is certainly a type of conflict that you may hear about, is turkeys acting bold, acting aggressively toward people, again, particularly in areas that are very developed and where there's a lot of people. And that's, again, all coming back to food. So it really is true that the decisions that we make every day affect wildlife behavior and the decisions that wildlife will make. And so if people decide to purposely feed animals like turkeys, these turkeys start to look toward people and toward our backyards for sources of food. And it starts to make those turkeys think that they're on level playing field to us. And then it leads into that pecking order of them then attempting to dominate people because they sort of are seeing themselves as the same. So intentional feeding can lead to bold and aggressive behaviors. It's not good for the turkeys. It's not good for people or communities. Again, turkeys can just rely on natural foods. They're from Massachusetts. They're designed to live here year round. They don't need handouts from us. So intentional feeding, please never purposely feed wildlife. But then there's also unintentional feeding. Maybe you're accidentally feeding turkeys. And this a lot of this comes down to bird feeders, the presence of bird feeders. So I think people put out bird feeders thinking like, oh, I'm gonna, support my local songbirds, right? I'm gonna support those little birds I'm thinking about. But in the end, you end up attracting a lot of other wildlife, including these larger birds like turkeys that come around to eat out of feeders, eat the seed off the ground around them. Again, it just doesn't, bird feeders tend to do a lot more harm than good to both turkeys and other wildlife. It just makes them really comfortable in close proximity to people, comfortable in residential areas. It's places where disease can spread because it gathers healthy and sick animals together. They come in direct contact with one another, and then disease spreads even more than it naturally would on its own. It can be a pretty troublesome decision to make. So again, if you're thinking about having those bird feeders out, or you're thinking, oh, I'll just put them out in the wintertime when animals need it, they really don't need our handouts. They can really rely on natural food sources. That's what they're built to do. That's why they were originally found here in our state in the first place. And then the last piece that can lead to conflict between people and turkeys is just generally turkeys having very neutral interactions with people, and just a lack of concern of being around people because maybe they're around people every day. And so eventually they, again, start to think of themselves as equal to people, and it comes back to that pecking order. And so they'll think of themselves as needing to dominate people. And that's when those bold or aggressive behaviors start to really present themselves. And that can be really challenging to reverse. And it can be really challenging for a community to have that type of stress as they utilize their neighborhood. What can we do to prevent conflict with turkeys? So big thing, never intentionally feed turkeys and other wildlife. Take down bird feeders and support local birds, songbirds, other ways, say planting native plants, trees, shrubs, providing bird baths or water sources when the season is right. Those are good ways to support songbirds without contributing to wildlife conflict. And then lastly, you can haze or harass turkeys in your neighborhood when they're on your property or around to make them less comfortable around people. And I want to talk about this a little bit more because hazing or harassing turkeys, well, it may initially sound kind of negative. It is actually good for these turkeys. It's good to remind them to be cautious around people and to show those more natural behaviors. And it's good for people too. So you may be wondering how to successfully haze a turkey. And so there's a couple things you can do. One, you can just use your own physical body, right? You are much bigger than a turkey. Again, those males float somewhere around 20 pounds or so. So use that nice dominant body language. Make yourself look nice and big. Really try to avoid running away from them, turning your back or retreating. Again, that's going to reinforce to them that they're the bigger bird, that they won, that they're dominant if you turn and run away. So try and hold your ground. You could a little bit of distance if you don't want to use your own physical body. You could spray them with a water gun, or if your hose is still hooked up, you can spray water in their direction. You could swat them with a broom. Again, all these recommendations aren't to hurt these birds. It's to remind them to be cautious. It's to make them less comfortable in these residential areas, less comfortable around people, so that they, again, show those natural behaviors, avoid developing bold and aggressive behaviors, and utilize natural sources of food. Again, more options for hazing a turkey. You could use a leaf blower in their direction. You could open and close an umbrella to make yourself look larger. I know some of you might have other hobbies, other things that you want to do other than haze turkeys all the time. So you can also put things in your yard that can help haze a turkey when you're not there, what we would call visual deterrence, which I'll show you an example of in a moment. But just a reminder that these efforts will be kind of futile if you just do them yourself and then your neighbor is still feeding them, hand feeding them, or has bird feeders out. So try to talk to your neighbors about this if this is a real challenge for you. Try to talk to your neighbors, and it's best when communities really work together to ensure that turkeys develop just healthy behaviors and maintain them. Again, these are just the ideas for your hazing toolkit to have in hand. The one thing I want to point out here is that visual deterrent that's on like the top left. That's like this yellow balloon. It's called Bird X balloon. And you can see those like circles kind of look like eyes. It would make the turkey sort of think like it's being watched a bit. These can be put in your yard, can be hung from trees. Best if you put them in areas where turkeys are like frequenting quite often, just to, again, disrupt their behavior and try and keep them on their toes, again, with the goal of making them uncomfortable. And so we've reached the end of our presentation, hopefully within the time that I said we would. But here's a rough recap of just what we talked about. So wild turkeys, they live in almost every city and town in Massachusetts. That wasn't necessarily always the case with that 120 years where we didn't have these fabulous birds, but they are here now and they're going to be here into the future. And we just need to take some steps to successfully live with them by making sure we're not purposely feeding them or accidentally feeding them around our homes. So that's sort of the end of our formal presentation here, and I think we're ready to take some questions if you all have them.
So folks, let's give Meghan a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation, and we have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please get them into the Q&A box. I will do my best to check the chat as well, but it would be great if all the questions could be in the Q&A box. So Sarah asks, are there particular native plants that are good turkey food?
That's a good question. Dave, if you have ones that you would recommend, otherwise we do have a website that we have a list of native plants that we generally recommend for supporting local songbirds that we recommend that people look to. But Dave, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, plants with turkeys, it's not so much about food as it is about like cover and providing, that kind of resource, that escape cover. Turkeys are, from a food standpoint, they're utilizing like a lot of nuts and seeds and things like that. So we get a lot of nuts out of like acorn, oak trees and hickory trees and things of that nature. I think generally we just want to have like a diversity of plants, whether it's like forbs and grasses and things like that, and little shrubs. And so some structure and some diversity there that just provides, again, like different types of spaces for those turkeys to utilize, or other animals. Again, we're primarily looking at it from the standpoint of other animals, attracting other animals, not necessarily turkeys specifically. If you want a really large property, there's lots of ways to deal with that. Again, with forest management, managing your oak trees, your oak forests, doing certain plantings, things like clover and such like that are going to provide some food. But think about just kind of plant diversity being an important thing.
And David and Megan, just to clarify, Nancy wants to know, are you saying not to feed the turkeys?
Correct.
Do not feed
Yes.
turkeys.
Do not feed turkeys. That is definitely our big message here. And again, if you are feeding turkeys because you care about wildlife, I totally understand why that initially might be something you'd want to do. Is like, I care, I want to see them, and so I want to provide them food, even especially potentially thinking of those winter times where food can be scarce. But is that it can really alter their behavior, and in the end, it causes a lot of harm to those turkeys and harm to communities. And just that reminder is, turkeys are built to live in Massachusetts year round. They were doing that, before we have this modern day Massachusetts where there's a ton of people everywhere with bird feeders, and they can continue to do that now. They don't need our assistance by any means.
So Marianne asks, what is the average lifespan of a turkey?
Yeah, I was looking at this this morning, actually. So Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that wild turkeys can live up to 13 years, in theory, 13 years. That would be a wild lifespan. I think on average, it's like 1.5 years. So pretty different. They're going to be preyed upon, or there's just a lot of other potential sources of mortality for turkeys. So they don't tend to live very long lives.
So Larry asks, we often see solo turkeys. Have they been ousted from their group?
Possibly, yeah. So turkeys do tend to want to be in groups. There's safety in numbers. And so if you do see a turkey on its own, there's a chance that maybe it's injured, or maybe it's just something a little off. And so the animals kind of said, hey, like, you're going to be on your own. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that bird needs any sort of assistance. But yeah, there's a possibility that that's at play. Dave, would there be anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so the only other time where you'll frequently see a single turkey alone is during the breeding season. So you have these nesting females. What happens with nesting females is they don't just sit on that nest 24 hours a day. They do have to get up occasionally and briefly to feed and to water. And so in the spring, early summer period, you'll see those hens kind of walking around by themselves. Not very frequently. And the other thing too is Jenny hens. So these non-reproducing females will also be walking around. So they always kind of tend to want to join up together, but really it's that period of incubation where we often see like a solitary hen walking around.
Yeah.
An anonymous attendee writes, I have read about people being so afraid of turkeys that they won't get out of their cars, but I've never actually heard of anyone being hurt by a turkey. Are there any reports of that?
Of people being hurt by turkeys? Is that what that question is?
Yeah.
Dave, you wanna take that one?
Sure. Yeah, unfortunately, yeah, it's very uncommon, but you get these aggressive males, whether it's in the spring breeding season or kind of like in the fall when the flocks are coming back together. They can become highly aggressive. They're going to want to try and peck at and scratch people, as Megan talked about. It's just part of their sort of social dynamics. People get kind of enveloped into that. And so, is it life-threatening sorts of things? Absolutely not, but not to downplay it. When animals are injuring humans, like, we take that very seriously. So yeah, it does happen. It's super infrequent, but occasionally people will get some scratches and some bruises from an interaction they might have with an aggressive male turkey.
I think I'd just add for a moment, just again, like doubling back to the actions that we take, right? If someone down the road is intentionally feeding turkeys because they love to see them, they're putting corn out or seed out, and then you have down the road maybe like a bus stop where children are each morning, getting ready to go to school, that person that's intentionally feeding those birds, they might never see those true negative behaviors that are presenting themselves as a result of that intentional feeding. But again, that bird isn't just going to stay right there. It's going to go interact with other people and potentially cause harm to other people that weren't intentionally feeding. So again, just think of those broad impacts, is that even if you're not seeing it happen right in front of your eyes, doesn't mean that those troublesome behaviors aren't occurring from those feeding decisions.
Yeah, and Marietta, just a follow-up question, and then we'll get on to happier topics. Marietta asks, how can I get out of my car if it's surrounded by turkeys? I can't open my umbrella until I get out of the car.
Yeah, So I understand that. I think I've heard people successfully kind of ward their turkeys off with the actual car, like the vehicle door is trying to create some space between you and them. If you have other tools, it's not just an umbrella that you can use, anything that you can use to make nice loud sounds, a jacket that you can flap in the wind, things that just generally would be visually spooking or surprising to a turkey just to create some space. Absolutely. But Dave, anything you want to add on that?
No, not really. I mean, use the door as sort of your tool to kind of pry them open and push them away. Again, they're responding to the movement of the car and the reflection of the car, and so use that door to its advantage in that kind of situation. But yeah, those are difficult and awkward scenarios for sure.
So Marilyn wants to know, do wild turkeys carry ticks? And Stephen wants to know, do the wild turkeys eat ticks?
I think yes, they carry them. Do they eat them, Dave?
Oh, the age-old tick question with turkeys and small game birds. There's a lot of rhetoric out there that turkeys and other small game, chickens, guinea hens, great for reducing tick numbers. And I would say unequivocally, there's absolutely no data to suggest that that's true. Do they eat ticks? Yeah, they probably do, but they're not doing so intentionally. They're doing so as an artifact of just their sort of normal foraging behavior. They're pecking at the ground, picking up seeds, picking up vegetative material. And, yeah, can they ingest ticks? Sure, but it's not anything that's going to, again, be specific or intentional, or is it going to have any profound effect on the local tick population? Now, do turkeys carry ticks? Sort of. It depends on where you are. And there's a couple of species of ticks that turkeys do transport around, the most notable being Lone Star ticks that we're just starting to see in the Cape and Islands. We don't really see those ticks in other parts of the state. In terms of like deer ticks, which are black-legged ticks or dog ticks, we don't see a lot of turkeys being impactful in transporting those things around. It's really those Lone Stars that are directly, turkeys are a direct host for them. So that's going on. But again, that's kind of limited to the Cape and Islands.
Several people asking, are wild turkeys considered threats to pets like small dogs or cats?
Generally, I'll say I've never received a call from the public saying that they've had conflict between turkeys and even small pets. And sometimes we'll even recommend, if people are having turkey issues on their property, is that a leash dog that would bark toward the turkeys and the like could be an effective deterrent too. So I can speak just from, and I get a lot of calls from the public about their interactions with turkeys, is that I've never received one where people feel that the presence of a turkey is a threat to their pet. But I'll let Dave, do you have any anecdotes about that piece?
Yeah, almost never.
Yeah.
Larry asks,
turkeys don't like dogs, right? Like dogs are sort of a natural prey predator. Like there's a thing there with that. And house cats are just too smart. They just don't want to mess with turkeys, and turkeys don't want to mess with them. So again, almost never.
Yeah. Larry asks, how do turkeys protect the eggs before and during incubation?
Well, they sit on them. I think that's more or less the main protection, is that hen is spending most of her time sitting on those eggs, incubating them. And that is a pretty vulnerable time still. So it's vulnerable for the hen. She can be preyed upon during that time by medium-sized, omnivores, carnivores, and other animals will take advantage of nests that are open for the taking, and they'll eat those eggs too. So they are subject to predation. But thinking back to those hens, and they're that drab color, they're those more muted colors, especially for that nesting period, so that they can be as well hidden, as well camouflaged as possible.
And just a follow up from Joan, assuming hens nest on the ground, which you said they do, how do they protect themselves from predators while sitting on the eggs?
They hide. I mean, that's one way. Dave, is that anything you'd add?
Yeah, so their coloration is basically it's this kind of dull drab camo-ish, brown feathers that are intended to blend into the background. and basically disappear into that. The other thing turkeys have going for them is their size. So even though hens are quite small relative to the males, it's still a 10, 12, 15-pound bird, which is relatively large for most of our mesopredators to be messing with. Not that a bobcat, a fisher, a weasel, coyote, fox, like they'll all take their chances with it, but in certain instances, that size is sort of a factor that helps the turkey more than it hurts it. But make no mistake, like the primary form of mortality for hens is when they're sitting on the nest. Like that's when they're vulnerable.
And hens can re-nest as well. So if their nest and their eggs do get, messed with, destroyed in some way, they are capable of re-nesting in a different location if they're able.
Peter asks, and we have similar questions, who are the biggest predators for turkeys?
Yeah, so if we're talking about poults, which again are those baby turkeys, you'll have things like foxes and hawks, birds of prey that'll take advantage of them certainly. And then, I think things like bobcats, coyotes, black bear, you think, Dave, as well? If it's an easy enough meal, if they're maybe a little succumb to something else?
Yeah, black bears don't say no to much, but
Yeah.
I think like with adult turkeys, it's those meso predator mammals that are doing the most damage there. Most of that is targeted to the females who are sitting on the nest. There's a sort of an interesting one where we see some adult predation from owls. So primarily great horned owls, which are taking them off the roost and killing them that way, which is would be wildly interesting to see how that happens, how a giant owl knocks a 20-pound turkey out of a tree and kills it. Would just be, again, it's amazing, but we know what happens. We know there's increasing numbers of great horned owls in the state, so very likely they're interacting with turkeys.
An anonymous attendee asks, at what age are turkeys able to roost up in trees?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I read about it, but I don't remember what the number is.
So it doesn't take very long.
Yeah.
Those turkeys, when they're born, they're on the ground. The hens are on the ground. She's brooding them overnight on the ground for a couple, 3 weeks. But they're growing super rapidly at that point. And again, within a couple of weeks, they're getting up into the trees to be able to roost. Again, that's where we see the largest pulse of poult mortalities in those first few weeks before they're able to roost.
So many questions. I've lost it. I think I might have accidentally dismissed it, but someone asking the connection between what we're about to eat for Thanksgiving and wild turkeys. Do wild turkeys taste the same as Thanksgiving Day turkey? I don't have the exact question in front of me, but I imagine it wouldn't necessarily be safe to eat a wild turkey.
So it is safe to consume a wild turkey, and that's why people hunt them, right? Remember, we have those fall hunting seasons and spring hunting seasons, and people do that often to consume that natural resource and feed themselves and their families, which is great. It does, I guess, more or less, they taste the same, and wild turkeys are just going to have a little bit less fat on them. So that's, I guess, I had heard even, I think our friends up at Vermont Fish and Game kind of describe it as, I guess if you like dark meat, then maybe you might like wild turkey, where if you're more preference of white meat when it comes to the turkey that you eat at Thanksgiving, then you might really prefer sticking with the domestic turkeys. But Dave, anything you'd add to that? Yeah.
No, I mean, you have to bear in mind that a wild turkey is exactly the same as a domestic turkey. It's the same species of animal. So
I'm so sheltered, Dave. I wasn't 100% even sure of that.
Yep.
And so that question came from Marilyn. She was concerned about like contaminants that a wild turkey might have.
No, I mean, I think when you're eating any wild game species, they are what they eat. And I think, across the state, they're eating these wild food sources. There's no information and no reason to believe that they're anything less than perfectly healthy to eat. So yeah, there's no restrictions on eating turkeys or deer or anything like that in our state at all.
All right, we're going to take 5 minutes more questions. Diane and Marcia both want to know how far and how high can a turkey generally fly?
I have no idea. I'm learning something today.
They want to fly as little as they absolutely have to and as low as they absolutely have to. They're big birds. They can fly. They're not migrating long distances. Their primary reason for flying, there's two. They want to get up into a tree and roost at night, and they're roosting, 30 to 50 feet high in some trees. Typically, the only other time that they fly is under predator attack. So if they need to get away in a super rapid hurry and they have the space to do so, they're going to fly and get away. They're not going terribly far. They're not going terribly high, only as high as absolutely, or as far as absolutely necessary. They spend the other 99% of the daylight hours on the ground, 2 feet on the ground.
Catherine wants to know, what is the average weight of an adult male or female turkey without its feathers? Very specific question, Catherine.
Yeah, I would guess the feathers wouldn't really add or take away too much weight.
Yeah.
If so probably pretty close to what we shared before, somewhere around 20 pounds for males, somewhere around 10 pounds for females, which is drastically different again as we're comparing it to domestic turkeys. And the turkey that a lot of people are going to be consuming this Thanksgiving is those animals they were selectively bred to be large and be large quickly. And so that's going to be a whole lot more meat on that bird than you would ever get meat off of a wild turkey that was harvested and people may be consuming.
And a group of turkey is called a what? I've heard flock. I've heard rafter. I think I've heard other things. What are your thoughts there?
A flock?
There we go.
That's what yeah. No fancy.
Let me see.
Yeah.
So Amanda asks, is turkey harvest necessary in controlling the population?
It's one way to allow people to access a natural resource, which is a great thing. I think too, it also does assist with potentially removing turkeys that do have more bold or aggressive behaviors because they just might be more visible during the hunting season. So it is a means of maybe accidentally addressing some of the conflict issues. But Dave, is there anything, would you change my answer? Would you add anything to it?
Yeah, I would just add that in a lot of the places where we have issues with overabundance of turkeys, hunting isn't really feasible, just given the amount of development and roads, right? Hunting laws are structured in a way where you have to be a certain set distance away from houses and roads to be able to legally hunt. And so it's sort of this, catch-22 where hunting could have impacts in some of those areas to change turkey behavior, but we can't hunt because there's too many people in those areas, too much development, too many houses, that sort of thing.
Lots of folks asking, so Sam asks, what exactly are the turkeys looking for when they scratch a lawn section bare? Several questions regarding that.
Yeah, so they scratch at the ground in search of food, and that food source it could be insects in the ground, grubs in the ground especially, or just trying to, maybe scratch through some leaf litter to access those acorns or other food sources, plant material, seed on the ground as well. So that scratching behavior is really related to feeding. And so if you are having issues with a turkey scratching up your yard, again, you could attempt with those visual deterrents to have things out there that are just unusual, shiny, reflective. Again, those bird X balloons, if you really want to invest in something that can make it so those turkeys stay away when you're not there. And then don't be afraid to haze or harass those turkeys when you are there and you see them out there, and chase them off and remind them to be cautious around people, and make sure that you and your neighbors are not intentionally feeding those turkeys with things like bird feeders and the like. That'll hopefully get them moving along.
Paula and Betsy both want to know, turkeys are plentiful on Martha's Vineyard. How did they get there? Any idea how we got turkeys to Martha's Vineyard?
I'll let Dave answer that question.
No, you answer it. The Martha's Vineyard turkey situation is a little bit interesting in that we didn't ever the state didn't intentionally release turkeys on Martha's Vineyard. Now, if you've ever been to the vineyard, in certain areas of the vineyard, you obviously know that there's an awful lot of turkeys out there. And those turkeys are kind of weird. That's a scientific term. Some of them have characteristics that are very consistent with wild turkeys, so it's possible that somebody illegally introduced turkeys on there. I guess there's a very, very, very slim chance that they flew there, whether from the Elizabeth Islands or from the mainland. I think that's pretty unlikely, given what I said before about how far turkeys tend to like to fly. So I think if anything, there might have been some illegal introduction, whether it was actual wild birds or captive reared wild turkeys, which exists in certain parts of the world. And then some of those birds out there actually have some characteristics that are maybe look like there's some domestic turkey intrusion into those characteristics of wild flocks. So we see some coloration differences and certainly some behavioral stuff going on out there that's different. The vineyard's very different in that, like the predator populations are quite different than they are from the mainland. So behaviorally, those turkeys are challenging. But no, we never introduced them. They are there. They continue to be there and persist there and be quite successful out there.
And then we have several people commenting in the Q&A that they never made it to Nantucket. Judy wants to know, why are there no turkeys on Nantucket, as does Wendy.
Yeah, so turkeys are not native to Nantucket, never were on Nantucket. Nantucket's too far away. It's too far away from the mainland. It's an island, and it's a small island that's really far away. So when you're talking about how like islands get colonized by wildlife, the bigger the island, the closer it is to the mainland, the more likely you are to see all the same species on the mainland and the island. Vineyard, again, Nantucket, quite a bit smaller than the vineyard, quite a bit further away from the mainland and other things. So there's just a lot of species that we find on the mainland that we don't see on Nantucket. And to this point, knock on wood, nobody dumped them out there when they shouldn't have, which is probably what happened on Martha's Vineyard.
So we're a little bit past 11:30. I think we're going to wrap it there. We have gone through, believe it or not, we had some duplicate questions, but we answered 33 questions. How about that? Pat on the back from David and Meghan. So Meghan, I'll turn it back over to you if you wanted to say something about this next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to share, we're so happy that people were excited to join us either live or if you're watching the recording, and just mention that there's other ways to get information from MassWildlife. And these are two really great ways to do it if you want to get, the latest wildlife news into your inbox or mailbox. So that top QR code is a QR code to sign up for our free monthly emails, our monthly newsletter that usually has, somewhere between 5 to 7 articles about some timely topic related to wildlife or fisheries management and populations. So definitely recommend subscribing to that if you haven't already. And if you want to take it a step further, we also have a Massachusetts Wildlife magazine. It's an actual publication that gets printed and mailed to our subscribers 4 times a year. And it's a $6 annual subscription for 4 printed issues. And again, those tend to be longer form articles. Sometimes we have guest writers, and they really do span all different types of topics. And generally people are pretty pleased to subscribe to that magazine too. So just wanted to mention that as an opportunity to just learn a little bit more from us. Maybe Robert, I could share the links to these as well to add to the follow-up email if people are interested.
Yeah. So folks, let's give Meghan and David a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Look for that follow-up email for me later this afternoon with a link to this recording, as well as information about some other upcoming virtual programs that might be of interest. I think we have a talk on cats coming up in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that. And when you exit the Zoom in a moment, please make sure to fill out the feedback survey. It should take you about 60 seconds. So thank you all so much, and I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you, Meghan. Thank you, David.